Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Can I just ask, we're doing it in a new way this morning, so please be patient with us. We're using some different technology. My name's Michaela Cronin. I'm the director of the Future Social Service Institute, which is a collaboration between RMIT and VCOSS. I want to open this fireside chat before I introduce our fabulous guests by acknowledging that we're meeting on Aboriginal land today, wherever you may be, whether it's in lockdown in stage 4 in Melbourne, in regional Victoria, or interstate. I'm on the lands of the Wadawurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and I want to pay my respects to their elders, their culture, their young people and emerging leaders, and acknowledge the work that we all have to do in working with them to overcome the intergenerational trauma that they have experienced and to help create the conditions for them to be empowered to lead their own way out of the impact of what has occurred in this country, and to acknowledge that these lands have never been formally ceded. And I think that's incredibly appropriate given that this conversation today is about, it's really at its heart about ensuring that people with lived experiences, voices, are very actively at the centre of all that we do. Mm-hmm. So I'm very pleased that both Larissa and Robyn accepted the invitation to join one of FSSI's Fireside Chats. They are both dear friends and colleagues who have incredible wealth of experience and expertise in this area. I'll start by introducing Robyn Martin. You've seen her bio on the introduction, so I'm not going to go into it in detail, but what Robyn brings to this conversation is decades of social work practice and teaching, practical and research experience in trauma, violence, abuse, homelessness, and other aspects of social service care. She is currently the Dean, the Associate Dean for Social Work and Human Services at RMIT. She moved over to take up that role from Western Australia in December, right at the end of the academic year last year. And who knew what you were coming into, Robyn, with fires and pandemic and everything else that's come down on us. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Michaela.
Larissa Hjorth is a distinguished professor at RMIT. She's a digital ethnographer, a socially engaged artist, and the director of the Design and Creative Practice Research platform at RMIT. And I have to say, it was one of the happiest moments in my time at RMIT when I discovered Larissa. She is a fabulous colleague and has helped me understand the place of how to make the best use of research and academics at RMIT. She is extremely well published with over 100 publications on the topic and on this topic, and has led 20 national and international research projects across the region and Australia. So thank you very much for joining us today, Larissa and Robyn. So I'm going to kick off this conversation by asking you both to talk to us about what is co-design? What is it? What are the important elements of it from your experience and practice? Would you mind kicking us off, Larissa?
Yes, thank you. And thank you for that wonderful introduction as well. That was wonderful. And I was just thinking, firstly, I just wanted to say to Robyn, as Victorians, we have really put on a show for you in terms of welcoming you. We had bushfires, now we have a pandemic. So you may want to talk about that later. I mean, co-design is a really interesting concept, and it is used in many different ways. So I'm going to talk through some of the ways that I understand it. And I think part of this conversation is to really flesh out those different ways in which it gets interpreted and utilised, because there's no right or wrong way in understanding co-design. So it is a process, and it is generative, it is exploratory, and it's participatory. And I think one of the things that I really enjoy about co-design is it's about embedding the stakeholders from the beginning to ensure that you not only have the right question, but you also have the implementation from the outset, because we can see there's been lots. I've seen a lot of really fantastic research fail to be impactful because it actually hasn't got the right stakeholders on from the outset. And I think one of the some of the kind of core things that co-design does really well and is really important, particularly given the current pandemic, is that it really does put care and reciprocity at the centre of what we do. And so it sees research not as an extraction, but actually as a process of care. So often some of the first questions that are asked are, rather than thinking, is actually about thinking about how the research can be useful and implemented by the participants after the researchers leave. So it's really about that longer journey of ideas and discussion to implement social change. But there are some core, core principles that often get utilised when thinking about doing co-design, and they are being inclusive, being respectful, being participatory, iterative, and also outcomes focused. And I think one of the other things that I really like about co-design is it sees participants as the experts. And this is where there's a lot of overlap between co-design and ethnography. It focuses, as Michaela highlighted, it focuses on lived experience, and it puts lived experience at the core of our learnings. And it also acknowledges that participants are the experts in these understandings.
Thanks, Larissa. Robyn?
Sure, thank you, and thanks for the introduction, Michaela. And yes, thank you for the welcome to Victoria, much appreciated. Look, I support everything that Larissa's kind of mentioned there, but I'm going to take a slightly different tack when I think about co-design. And part of what I get a little bit troubled about and troubled within myself, and sometimes the language, is the language of co-design and the language of co-production, for example. And I think one of my key learnings has been to see the distinctions there. So I might just quickly speak to co-production and then come back to co-design, because all of these ideas have, for me, their history in good public policy and citizen involvement. So it's interesting to think about the history of the ideas. But as Larissa says, it's this idea that the people with the experience, who are living the experience or experiences, are actually the experts. So when I think about co-production, it's very much about the people with lived experience are driving. They're driving the design, they come up with the idea, they take it forward, they bring people along with them. And I've increasingly started to think about co-design as something that is not quite as sort of user-led, but the ideas might come, let's say, from researchers or practitioners, and those ideas are put out and floated with those with the lived experience to say, is this something that we should be pursuing? Is this something we need to understand better? How might we go about that? I think what's at the heart of both co-production and co-design for me are questions about power. And they're questions about voices and experience which are silenced or subjugated or put to the side. And I think these co-processes are about putting those at the centre, and they're about privileging them, and they're about understanding our relative privilege as well. So if I think about myself as an academic or a social work practitioner and a white person on Indigenous land, what are the privileges that I bring and the associated kind of power and access to power that I might have in those conversations? I also think for practitioners and those with relative power, co-design is a bit of getting out the way and being an ally and standing alongside. And again, I'm kind of referencing power relations there. And I think there's a final point for me, that it's about having lived experience speak for itself rather than other people representing or representing lived experience. So they're the sort of parameters for me.
Yeah, very, very helpful start from both of you. Thank you, Larissa and Robyn. We've already had one question, and I just wanted to also just encourage people to put their questions into the chat. I'll integrate them into the conversation as they come through. I'm curious about, you both speak so passionately, and both today, but I have heard you talk a lot about very passionately about why this is important Can you talk a little bit about why it's important to you in your practice, and if you remember if there was a turning point? When was the turning point that you realised that this was going to be an important part of your practice? Do you want to kick off, Robyn?
Sure. I've reflected on this a bit, and again, I think it comes back to my particular interest around power and power relations. And I was kind of tracing it back, and I grew up in a family. I was very fortunate to grow up in a family that was a very political family. It was relatively embarrassing as a child and a young person, I have to say, but it instilled something in me around justice and injustice. And so at the heart of it for me is there's a deep injustice when we don't hear from those experiencing the issues. So that's kind of it's genesis in a sense for me. And then, you know, I became a social worker. What sort of surprise is there in terms of my family of origin? And I think increasingly noticing where people are spoken for and spoken about, and increasingly seeing service systems and approaches not being very effective, and curious about, well, why not? And what if we were to listen differently and ask different questions? What else might we find out about this particular problem? So I think some of the turning points for me relate to my engagement with people with lived experience, service users, their supporters, their families, and actually getting some pretty harsh and critical feedback from people, and people saying, how would you know? Like one example comes to mind of when I was in WA, I was co-leading and I co-designed a program called the Valuing Lived Experience Project. And one of the things we did was we developed and delivered a course for people with lived experience to train up as educators to come into the academy and inform our students and ultimately health and human service workforces. And in the course, a family member said to me, this is great, love these ideas, they're really political, but you haven't once mentioned families. You only talk about individuals. Now, you know, it was kind of like, I could have said, oh yeah, sure, I'll make sure I include families in my conversation. But in fact, it was at the heart of me seeing something and not seeing other things, like not seeing the role that families play. And also in the mental health space, engaging in the contested territory, for example, between service users and families, where some service users might say, my experience is a result of what happened in my family, and how do families interact in that space. So that would be one of the turning points that I'd share. Yeah, there's a few others, but I'll hand over to Larissa.
Thanks, Robyn.
Thank you. I was still wanting to listen to you, Robyn. I was getting quite happy. Yeah, I mean, I think every time I do a project, I learn from it in a big way. And I think that's kind of core to the co-design principles. I suppose, like you, Robyn, my early background really influenced a sense of social justice, but also my mother travelled a lot around Asia, and so I became, that for me was very much a big part of informing how I understood Australia and how I understood kind of what was meaningful for me. And I think a lot of my learnings have been in that context of doing comparative cross-cultural research, where often, you know, when you're in context, whether it be in Japan, where you know, you've got to decenter the language, and you've got to, like, so English, you've got to decenter English and prioritize Japanese, and understand that some concepts in Japanese can't translate to English, and the other way. And so that's made me have to think a lot about the methods, and perhaps using things like multi-sensorial methods to kind of elicit types of storytelling. And this is getting back to Robyn's point about power and representation, that sometimes people, for whatever reason, may not feel comfortable using, you know, like talking or whatever, but they'll feel comfortable illustrating it. And I think allowing different people to represent their experiences through diverse means is really crucial to getting those mixed voices. So I've learned. My biggest learning was actually in Japan when we were doing a project, and ARC linkage, which actually came to fame because when Tony Abbott was coming in, he actually, when you remember, he got that list of all the grants he wouldn't fund because they don't reflect liberal ideologies. This one had two of the key things, you know, two things that he didn't believe in: climate change and art. And so he kind of like, you know, really, you know, showed that one. It was a project called Spatial Dialogues, and what it was looking at was artists and the role of artists to change the communication science around climate change, so that it's not just this polemic, politicized debate, but actually really part of our everyday lives. And we were doing, Japan was one of our case studies, and then Fukushima happened. And that really, really complicated things, because we not only had the cultural context, but we also had grief. And grief, working with grief when you're co-designing is another whole layer of translation and complexity and attunement. You need different temporalities, you need different methods, you need to listen, you need a lot of to listen to the silences, you need, it's a completely different way of approaching it. So I think, yeah, the cross-cultural experiences have been a real eye-opener for redeveloping my toolkit, I suppose, and also things like grief and understanding how we can do grief better, like how we can have conversations about grief and open up those conversations in ways that make people feel comfortable, because like in Anglo-Australia, we still don't really have the kind of public spaces that allow for what should be talked about, because grief is actually a core part of how we live. So.
And I think if I could just jump in there, Michaela, if you don't mind, like I'm sort of seeing principles and some ideas emerging here. And just as you're speaking, Larissa, I was thinking about one in particular, which is about uncertainty and ambivalence. And I think your conversation about grief just sort of prompted that for me, because that for me is the characteristic, one of the characteristics of these spaces is, and it was a turning point for me as well, is to be able to say, I don't know where this is going to go. We've got some hopes and some desires and aspirations about where this is going to go, but I doubt it's going to be a straight road there. And if it is, fabulous. And in that, I think there's some sort of assumption busting that happens as well. I was thinking about an example of a course that I co-taught in Perth, which was, it's a particular approach to working with hearing voices, and it comes from the Netherlands. And the model that we used and we co-designed with people who hear voices was that we had our students, and then we had what we called our teachers, who were voice hearers, who came in and tutored our students. And so we called them teachers, thinking it was a very respectful way to acknowledge their deep experience and expertise. And the feedback was actually, you know, school for most of us has been really painful and traumatic. That's really triggering for us to be called that. Can we think about another term? And it was just such a surprise for myself and the person with lived experience who was co-teaching it, because we were like, oh, wow. Okay, so we thought this was the way to go, and in fact it's not. And I think there's a few ways you can respond to that. You can take it as a bit of an insult and say, oh, well, you know, I was trying to do the right thing. Or you can just kind of get out the way of yourself really and your ego and say, oh, okay, my intention was this, it didn't work out. Where do we go now? What's the language? And what they ended up calling themselves tutors and mentors, but they said to us, there's not one term that's going to fit us all. So you'll just have to deal with that uncertainty. And it's kind of like, well, I think we can, you know, and I might get it wrong sometimes. So, you know, I'll apologise if I do.
I think, Robyn, there's a couple of key things I want to kind of echo about what you've said. One, and you've said it a couple of times, about getting out of the way, out of the way of yourself, and getting out of the way of your own expertise and your own sense of your own expertise, which is not an easy thing to do as a professional and as a practitioner, because it's like, that's what I'm here for, isn't it? And the other is uncertainty. Because if you are really going to be listening and led by others, then there's that can be quite anxiety provoking in terms of control, giving up control. It's about power and control, and that it is uncertain where it's going to go. When I was a young social worker, we ran a group for young women who used self-harm, and I went and looked for the book, Larissa, the other day after we were talking about the Big Anxiety Festival, and I remembered when I found the book that we'd had this discussion about co-authoring. This is more than 20 years ago, and that the organisation that was funding us had a real issue with us. We advocated very strongly that the young women in those groups, in the group, co-authored the book, but it was not as well accepted a framework as it is now. And I'm very proud that their names are all on the front of it. There was actually a question before about that, about government and systems, and saying that they want co-design, consultation, co-production, participation, but do they really want it, and what does that look like? And I think, yeah, I'm curious about both of your reflections on that.
For me, possibly not is my shorthand answer, but that's where I think our responsibilities lie in terms of holding the line, advocating, pushing back against predetermined agendas and outcomes. So I think this work has a kind of advocacy stance associated with it. It's more than being in the process.
Yeah. Larissa?
I absolutely agree with Robyn's answer. I mean, I think the thing about co-design is it's messy, and I don't think governments like a lot of mess. I mean, you know, life is messy, and they want to be able to, you know, policy briefs are about, you know, having neat borders and things like that. So it is, and this is where co-design can be used in very, I think when Robyn was clarifying it from co-production, I mean, I think it does get used as shorthand for, oh, we kind of consulted with people, we kind of co-designed with them. And I often pick people up when they are using it in that way, because it's simplifying it, and it's emptying out of all of its complexity and messiness, which is actually what makes it really powerful, I think. We've got another question here from Caroline about community groups. So she's doing a community project with people who were in the bushfire area. So could I maybe try and answer this one first and then hand over to Robyn? We've got actually a fantastic expert at RMIT, Yoko Akamara, who did a lot of work about community resilience with Black Saturday. And I know that RMIT has just now, after the bushfires, we actually restarted the disaster network to actually, you know, bring together those capabilities again. Because I mean, with a pandemic, everyone's been focused on the pandemic, but actually there's a whole lot of grief. You know, I mean, the people in the bushfire areas are now having this kind of double layering of grief in terms of, you know, the kind of the phenomena. And I think one of the key things looking at Yoko's work, and then the work that really inspires me in looking at co-design with bushfire communities, has been the idea of using co-design to kind of probe some of the kind of uncomfortable, awkward material that needs to be explored for people to actually then be able to understand what the community's gone through, but also to have dimensions of creative practice in there to actually give people a sense of hope. So we did a workshop with some participants earlier this year, which Yoko co-led with Caitlin as well, which looked at smartphones during the use of smartphones during the bushfires. And one of the great things about when you ask somebody to tell you about their media practice, you're actually not asking them about technology, you're actually asking them about this, you know, social relationships and intimacy. And so in this workshop, we got people to explore, you know, what was successful, what was triggering, because a lot of people found that the emergency app, actually having that on, caused a lot of triggering, which was very hard to manage. And so we were also looking at informal process of the workarounds, how people find ways to not allow things to trigger, etc. But one of the key things was, after we'd gone through, kind of exploring some of the dimensions of the grief, it was really important that people were able to walk away with some hope in that piece. And I think this is where we got them to design a whole lot of postcards about what they would give out to people to make them feel better. So it's like they actually take the lead in kind of being champions for hope during this period of actually great grief. And that's something really, I think, is really important about workshops, is actually allowing people to walk away with something where they feel they contributed, and they actually then feel it's going somewhere to kind of changing things. And I think that social change dimension is really core to, like people will say to me, oh, do you need to use vouchers and things like that? And I'm like, no, you don't use extrinsic motivators. If somebody believes in this, they will come along, and it will be an intrinsic motivator that will actually, that's why they're there, and they want to help. They want to be part of that social change journey.
I think the other thing I'd like to add to that, in terms of the question around what is it that government want, I think part of it is also our responsibility around it takes longer. It takes longer, and that needs to be factored into any program and planning, that to genuinely listen and engage means processes that require listening and extra time. We're getting some great questions through, so I'm just going to pick a couple of them. So there's a question from Kim, thanks Kim, around best practice ideas in terms of engaging hard to reach groups of people. So working with asylum seekers and refugees who are possibly fearful of engaging with researchers, and the very sensitive topics that you've both talked about. So can you talk about your experience, both of you, with that, how engaging hard to reach groups, and tips? I think there's some people wanting some practical tips in their work.
Yeah. And look, my answer also responds to that previous question about how to start in connecting community groups in terms of bushfire and bushfire impacts. And it actually picks up the question about in government as well. So it's a little bit of a kind of, bringing it together, but picking up on this idea that this takes time. The reason it takes time is that what we might have thought was a good idea, and this does go to the hard to reach groups, might not be a good idea for the community or the group of people. And so it starts with a sort of very exploratory, we were thinking that there could be some value in connecting communities. I'm just going to use that example. Is that what's most important for this particular group? Now, in terms of reaching groups who very rightly so may be suspicious of engagement, it means that I think you need to use multiple systems and technologies to engage with people. So the question could be in a social media post. We had this idea, but we don't know if it's a good idea. What do other people think? And that starts to open up access. And I think it starts also with a really deep acknowledgement and respect for why some groups don't want to be reached. And my strategy around that has been to demonstrate my trustworthiness with people in those groups or those communities. And sometimes that takes a really long time. I'm thinking about some work I've done with Indigenous people, people who spend a lot of time in public spaces, are homeless, are experiencing other health issues, and the ways in which you can demonstrate trustworthiness. And sometimes it'll take 12 months or longer. So for me, it's part of the process. It's part of being corrected by members of those communities or those groups, being reprimanded sometimes about not getting it right, and being humble enough to say thank you for taking the time to give me that feedback. And also to hear from some groups, actually, we're not going to open the door. This is not something that we feel safe enough to do that with, and to be able to walk away and deeply respect that as well.
Yeah, very good points, Robyn. Can I just note that we'll be putting out this this is recorded. We'll be putting it out with a newsletter with any of the resources that Larissa and Robyn refer to. Will be in that newsletter, so we'll get them out to you. I want to, just looking back at the questions, there was also one around NDS in terms of the introduction of the National Disability Insurance Scheme and the hopes around that, hearing silenced voices, and the impact of the bureaucracy that has flowed from that. I'm summarising a bit, Tim, and the impact that. So, can I ask a bit about that in terms of working with populations where there has been an intention to hear. There's really good intent, and then sometimes a big bureaucracy actually struggles to respond to that. Happy to respond to that, Larissa.
Yes. I mean, one of the interesting things about NDIS, I mean, there's many interesting things, is that when it was first planned, it was planned. They first kind of tested it with around 1,000 people, and then they had to upscale it to 500,000 people. A lot of those methods don't translate and adapt, and that's part of the problem. And this is where co-design once again comes back to the methods and knowing methods, like what methods you use. It's a toolbox, and it's like you've got to have the right tools, and you've got to change the tools depending on the scale, the intensities, the complexities, and I think that attunement to methods is really, really crucial. And getting back to that point about engaging hard to connect audiences, I mean, this is really where the multisensorial methods really have to come in. And it's slow work. It will often take, I look at the kind of the work that I admire. For example, Ellie Rennie has done a lot of important work with Indigenous communities about in rural areas about digital inclusion, and this was part of the Telstra digital inclusion study, which then impacted, companies like Telstra have actually changed a lot of their policies thanks to that kind of field work. But that work took years and years and years, and you can't parachute that work. That work is about building trust over a long amount of time, and it is slow. It's really, really slow, and it's about using different methods. So, for example, with the younger people, texting, etc., using the different types of digital technologies, which may not necessarily be applicable for older generations. Although I'm not going to do that kind of older people don't know how to use technology, because the National Seniors Association did a fantastic report on the kind of silver surface, as they're called, and actually there's high literacy there. So I'm not going to make any of those kind of assumptions, but just understanding the methods and thinking through the methods to think about when people are high risk. And somebody that I think also who's really good at RMIT is Jazz Choi, who's done a lot of work with Brotherhood St. Lawrence and hard to connect communities, and she's used a lot of different creative methods to try and engage people in different ways. So I'll just put her name down in the chat.
Thanks, Larissa. Can you both, building on, sorry, Robyn, you want to say something?
I was just going to sort of, I think, add to that and confirm Tim's point and say, Tim, I feel that there could have been some incredible opportunities with the NDIS, and I'm not feeling overwhelmingly hopeful in terms of the true engagement, the deep engagement with lived experience. When we have a system where people need to shape their responses to demonstrate worst case scenarios and highest possible need to receive a service, we've got an issue and we have a problem. And the way that people need to perform disability, whether it's psychosocial or other forms in the interviews, is troubling.
Yes, we could have a long conversation about this. And FSSI have a couple of fellows, PhD fellows, who are doing some research in this area. So we'll highlight something about that in the next newsletter as well. I'm curious, you both talked about a toolbox and a range of different methods. I think it might be nice to hear an example of a process that you've been through, and some concrete kind of what are some of the tools that were appropriate in that situation? Would you mind both sharing an example of your work?
Yeah.
Do you want to kick off, Larissa?
Yep. So yes, so multi-sensorial methods, what are they?
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So an example I would give was that we were doing a project with CoHealth around engaging their communities. And the thing about CoHealth, which is a community health organisation which has 70 different offices and areas all around Victoria, is that they actually have a really deep reach into some very diverse communities, very culturally and linguistically diverse communities. And so we were working with the Collingwood CoHealth organisation, who have very, very rich, like we're looking at 50 years of community engagement with what were the new refugees, the Vietnamese refugees, more recently Sudanese, etc. And it's a lot of that kind of community engagement work that often gets, I suppose, to the public gets kind of lost. And it's actually, that is what community health does so well. And this is what we were looking at in terms of CoHealth, is capturing some of those stories and trying to capture them for public engagement, because if people understand that community health isn't just the kind of medical, but is actually much more about, as Robyn was highlighting, the psychosocial. So when we were working with the different groups, and there was a lovely group of Vietnamese women of which one of them had been there for 50 years, and she had some amazing stories. And of course we have translators there, but there was, the translation can only do so much. And what really engaged them was we used things like photos. So we brought out photos from the archive where they could actually talk through some of the stories about how CoHealth used to function as this site for, like, politicians used to come and kind of launch their policies there. And the community felt really like that kind of citizen engagement piece. But it was really, when we were working with them, there were some that felt okay about talking to the translator, and that they knew that translator, so there was trust there, which was good. But others were quite shy and didn't really feel very comfortable talking in that context. So what we did was we set up the table with a whole lot of activities, including everything from serious play, which is like Lego type things, to drawing, to making, etc. And we basically just worked with each of the participants to see what kind of things suited them. And of course, what happened was they made these amazing works, which were all about, they used food as a metaphor for talking about how they connect, how they think about culture, how they would like things to be run. So, like food as the metaphor for politics, food as a metaphor for social cohesion, etc. And it was really, really powerful, and we were able to get a voice from everyone there, which we wouldn't have had we just relied on a translator to just be, putting things into words. And I think some of the images as well that we got from the workshop were really powerful. They said, 1,000 words, and they said them in such succinct ways. They talked about relationality in really kind of complex ways. And yeah, so I think, but once again, it's about having that toolkit of very different methods and understanding that some methods just will not work, and acknowledging the failure in some methods is really important as well.
And taking your whole toolkit in case something doesn't work. Lovely example, Larissa. Thank you. Robyn, you got an example to share?
Yeah, I do. And it's a great example because it reminds me of the limitations of language and speech, actually, and being able to move beyond that. Yeah. Look, the example I'm going to share, it speaks a little bit to this question that's there at the moment about short timelines and 12 months, and you've kind of got everything done in that period of time. And it's the project I referenced earlier. It came about through connections with Indigenous agencies in WA, and in particular those agencies that were providing services to they were called people in the parks, and they were mostly people who had been brought from the north of WA to the city for treatment, often dialysis and a lot of chronic kind of conditions. And there was a discourse emerging in the city of Perth and the city of Fremantle that these people in the parks were incredibly disruptive. They were, causing enormous problems for businesses in the area and residents and all sorts of things. And it's important to share a bit of Perth's history. So Perth City had a curfew on Indigenous people entering the city from 6 p.m. For a very long time until the 60s, okay? And there was an area that was known as the Bull Ring, which was an area just outside this curfew where Indigenous people would gather and connect and share stories of families and all sorts of things. So in this discourse that was emerging, particularly from the inner city residents who'd moved to the inner city because they wanted the kind of, excitement of an inner city life, was we now need a curfew. We need to stop these people coming in here because they're so disruptive. So we've got this kind of public issue, and it was really picked up by a lot of media outlets. And then the Indigenous outreach workers saying, but hang on a minute, people have been brought, 3,000 kilometres to the city. They don't know anyone. They're not presented as model citizens in terms of receiving healthcare because they're not always compliant. We're trying to do something here, but we don't know what to do. Everywhere we turn, we're facing barriers. And so the approach for us was, okay, so how can we articulate the lived experience of people who are spending time in the parks? Because essentially everyone has got something to say about these people, but we don't hear from them at all. So our approach was to partner with the Aboriginal organisations, and myself and another non-Indigenous researcher were invited to do this work. And we were very clear that it was not our place to be collecting data in the traditional sense from people in the parks. It was completely and utterly inappropriate, whereas they had good relations with the outreach workers. And so in a nutshell, we co-designed the research approach with the outreach workers, and their managers were involved as well. Now, these outreach workers had never undertaken research. They weren't necessarily connected to what gets called evidence for practice, but they had brilliant practice wisdom. They were connected in their communities, being Indigenous, so they brought all of that to the table. And one of the things they said to us early on was, well, we don't understand what you research fellas do, so you better tell us about it, was kind of almost the quote, and it was like, great, okay. So let's talk about, for example, so we based on their requests, we developed some workshops, and we were mentored by an elder who was had been a health worker for a very long time, and she had a research background. And so, for example, we did these sort of mini workshops around what's the difference between an outreach conversation and a research conversation. And so we could say, well, it looks a bit like this, and let's say if somebody was a bit under the weather at the time when you're doing your outreach, you'd probably keep it fairly straightforward. We do the same in research, And then we talked about consent, for example, and informed consent. So based on those workshops, we then co-designed the research framework. The outreach workers conducted the interviews, which were very kind of naturalistic. One of the issues we came across was there was a question about, I don't know, somebody said, I don't know that you can give people vouchers. So this was very much about recognising people's contributions to the research. And a couple of people said, oh, look, I'm worried about that. People might go and spend it on booze. They might do this, they might do that. So we stepped back and just said, as a group and as a community, we'll ask for your guidance on this, because this is our usual research practice. We acknowledge people's contributions. And we navigated that. And someone else said, oh, people will just sign up for the interview because they want the voucher. Well, none of that transpired, by the way. So, that was good to kind of test that out and find out. And we then co-analysed together. And again, that was an opportunity for us to provide some sort of naturalistic workshops for the workers to understand. And then we co-wrote and we co-published in Qualitative Health Research. It was challenging, it was never straightforward, but probably one of the most satisfying things I've done.
Sounds like an incredible piece of work, Robyn.
one of the things that, so one of the questions is around, so back to your point of drawing the connection to how long this takes and how messy it can be. And there, in that instance of the example you're talking about, there's a fairly timely, urgent driver to be doing that piece of work. And the question is around comparing with New Zealand, right? So talking about New Zealand's co-design lab and what's happening there in terms of frameworks for co-design, because you've both talked about very important situations in which really listening to it, I don't know how you could have got anywhere near as good an outcome if you hadn't undergone that kind of a process. How do we get to the point where these kinds of approaches are not just given lip service to, but are genuinely embedded in practice and in what expectations are around the way things will be done, the amount of time and effort? Because not only does it take time, but it's more resource intensive, so it costs more to do this properly. How do we progress that conversation in Victoria, I think is the thrust of the question.
I think, because I didn't quite answer this question, but we completed that project in just under 9 months. So we moved pretty quickly, but we also did slow at different points, I have to say. And going to that, answering that question, Michaela, I think it's about resisting and continuing to put up examples of when it works well, forming alliances, connecting strongly, you know, drawing on different disciplines. You know, so just in this conversation, I'm thinking with Larissa, there's some things I really want to do, you know, in terms of the, you know, multi-sensorial approaches, the toolbox, all of those sorts of things. So I do think there's some acts of resistance and keep just holding the line and saying, actually, this does work. This has really good outcomes wherever we can. And I think sometimes there's some ethical decisions for researchers to refuse some pieces of work because they don't fit in these areas. And that has a whole kind of, you know, set of implications for academics and researchers and career progression and all sorts of things that I won't go into, but I'll name them there. I'll put them there.
Yeah. I'd just like to add on to that, the timeline issue, because I think this is it's a key question that comes up all the time, because the Academy rewards and encourages deep research, which is longitudinal, which goes over time. You know, like most of my projects are 3 years, you know, sometimes 6 years, 10 years. And it's like, you know, I grew up watching 7-Up and thinking that's the way that you do research, you know, maybe not with the kind of austere British, you know, kind of I'll give you a man at age 7 kind of thing. But, you know, for me, that's been where, you know, coming back to the kind of core principle of reciprocity, that's where it's really kind of crucial, having that time to build up that trust, that understanding, so that then the research becomes a process of care and reciprocity. And it's really hard when you're looking at a 12-month grant where, you know, pretty much once you've got ethics in, it's like, you know, 2 months down the track, and then, you know, it's really rapid. And I think this is why there's been a lot of innovation around things like rapid ethnography and things like that, because we do, as the Academy speaks more and more to industry, and it needs to recalibrate some of those expectations and some of those methodologies. And, you know, rapid ethnography doesn't just strip ethnography. Do you know what I mean? It's not, rapid ethnography can actually be quite a powerful tool depending on the context. And so, and I'm thinking of, for example, Sarah Charlesworth's work in the aged care space, and where they've used rapid ethnography to look at case studies all across the UK and Canada and New Zealand and Australia. And given, you know, what's happened with aged care at the moment, we need those rapid ethnographies to really bring home that evidence to once again highlight, you know, we need change. This system is broken. And so it's not necessarily compromised, but I think it is about having really those conversations, as Robyn highlighted, about expectations and really calibrating those, because industry has particular, you know, they need they need outputs every couple of months, or else they think there's no pulse happening, you know. So it is really about having those two different kind of temporalities and allowing them to meet at certain points, so that both partners get what they want. But you know, I think it is, and it is very. I think Robyn's point about sometimes saying no to certain projects is also it's a hard thing, because, you know, like, you kind of see it as a challenge. You go, yeah, I can do this. But part of those learnings is sometimes to go, well, actually, maybe I can't do this. And that's a really crucial part of, you know, kind of learning journey.
There's a couple of questions that just popped up. And where I was about to go, I'll weave in one of the questions, because where I was about to go was a lot of the people on this call are going to be community service practitioners, social workers, and other professionals. And what I think is really useful about what the Institute has been set up to do is bring those conversations together between the academy, so academics, research teachers, government, and industry, so the social service sector. And how do practitioners get the best outcomes using these methods in their work as much as in research? So there's an alignment, Robyn, between the example you used and, as you said, social good practice, good community service practice with that group of people that you were working with. How do you, and part of the point of having this conversation and the work that we want to do is around it, is educating what is it and what are the outcomes. So the question is about what outcomes can you achieve from these co-design processes and what can occur in the community. So what are your thoughts and any examples about, so Robyn, for example, that piece of work that you did, what was the outcome of that? What have you seen in terms of the impact of your work because of using these processes?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for reminding me of that, because that was probably the most important thing, and I didn't say that. But what occurred was that the agencies and the individual outreach workers would say, but hold on a moment, while you're talking about people in this way, we want to share with you what we found out. This is what people said to us. This is why people are here. So it actually shifted the discourse. People no longer, you know, whether it was kind of like funders, I don't know that it shifted community discourse in terms of the residents and the business people. I'm not convinced about that, but that seemed to drop off a bit, because people were then saying, well, actually, I'd like to present you with another story around this. Let me talk to you a bit about history and let me talk to you about what's happening now. And so there was an increased understanding and awareness, including on the behalf of the police, who the people in the parks felt that they were harassed and harangued by the police at different times, particularly in Fremantle and somewhat in Perth. So there was a shifting and a more open understanding of why people were there. So the police were demonstrating more of a social response rather than a purely legal response. However, I would say this to you, were there any less people in the park? No. So it didn't change anything there. It certainly changed attitudes and discourse, but it didn't change the fact that people were still spending a lot of time in the parks.
Thanks, Robyn. Larissa, outcomes of some of the work. We're actually, and we've got about 5 minutes left, so you're going to start wrapping it up. But keen to hear yours.
Great. I just wanted to signpost that someone in the comments has done a nice little neologism about what are the outcomes and impact of this co-design process. Academics. So love it. Yes. So in terms of outcomes, I am a methods person, but co-design is very much focused on that outcomes delivery. And I think that's why when I was talking about the workshops with around the bushfires, for example, when we were exploring grief, we needed to be able to have that moment in the workshop where people could shift their thinking and their discussion to think about making something that could be more about hope. And I think that's something that more and more in the work I do, I've really you know, I really think that part of the process is not just the communication science piece, that whether it be to public or whether it be to government or whether it, you know, depending on the context, but it's also about how that communication science piece can create hope. I think more and more, particularly the topics like, say, looking at trauma and grief, it's really crucial to not see joy as something that is distant from grief. Actually, it can actually be that they need each other. And so a lot of the projects, we've done a lot of projects on social media, so using social media to make work and take some of the kind of findings from the workshop and put it so that then it becomes about distributing to other audiences, so that the people who are outside of that can actually contribute. And so, yeah, so just thinking through how digital media can be used in different ways to continue the conversations and to continue that kind of journey and process. So some of them work better than others. But yes, I'm always trying to think about, I do exhibitions as well. So one of the projects we did around mobile games in homes, we did a 3-year study looking at intergenerational literacy, which we're seeing a lot of now thanks to COVID-19. Suddenly, World Health Organization were like, games are bad, they're destroying people. Suddenly it's like, games are good, they're actually so about social inclusion. It's the only way our kids are communicating with each other. And so we did an exhibition which was actually where we made a kind of Minecraft, a physical Minecraft, and people could move the exhibition around, and then they photographed themselves doing that, and then their photographs on social media became the photographs. So they actually went from audience member to player to artist. And that was really kind of key, was actually getting people to, you know, you've got to think about innovative ways in which to embed social change. And sometimes, you know, creative practice can be a really powerful piece to change those conversations. I think about like Peter Murray's work, using theatre as a way to change the conversation about death and dying, can actually be a fantastic prompt that, you know, I think academics, the more that we can use the creative practice as a kind of way to change the communication science, the better.
I just want to reassure people that Larissa keeps referring to a whole rich wealth of knowledge, and Robyn has access to as well. We will ask both of them. We will include stuff in the newsletter that goes out. So please be reassured about that. There's a really interesting comment too from Sandy in terms of outcomes and what some prohibitions for funders being around, not actually just the issue around the time and the resources, but actually, you know, around worry about what again, it's about the control of the outcomes, you know, about the findings, whether or not they are within existing government policy parameters. So I think there's some really interesting themes through this conversation. One of them is around, there's been quite a few questions around the ethics, the ethical, you know, the ethics of the approach and how to handle that. I think it's one of those things that sometimes we as practitioners get afraid of. What if I don't do it properly? What if I get it wrong? And I think, Robyn, your point about being humility and being humble about being prepared to be corrected is incredibly important. And I think all of us many of my key learnings as a practitioner have been when I've got it wrong and when someone's told me very, very bluntly often about just how wrong I got it. But so the ethics, the toolbox, the breadth of the toolbox that you need to have at your disposal, and both of you sharing different approaches. Part of the reason I was really wanting to bring both of you together is because you come from very different disciplines, but have a very common kind of approach to and language around what you do. Can you just as we finish, we've just hit 1:30, and the intention of these is to do it in a lunch hour. So while I think all of us could keep talking for a while, let's try and keep it to that. Any parting thoughts from either of you, just to close it out about the conversation we've been having?
I just think a next step in this kind of conversation is to have it with some people with lived experience, some service users, and do a bit of a compare and contrast. Actually, would be a really interesting exercise.
Okay, all right. I'll take you up on that, Robyn. We'll help organise something together. Great idea. Larissa?
Yes, I agree with Robyn. I think that's a fantastic idea. I mean, I suppose just the last parting thought would be, I mean, I think it's about interrogating reciprocity, and I think that's, I think, you know, power, etc. I think we've travelled a really rich terrain in the last hour, and I hope everyone's enjoyed their lunch. And I think, you know, that reciprocity is really kind of crucial in that, you know, a good ongoing relationship really needs that as core. So I just would like to park that there as a kind of key concept to take away.
And Larissa, it's a lovely parting thing to share, because I think actually that's part of this conversation as well. You know, the conversation that is so rich for academia and industry to hear from each other. You know, that's the whole intention of these conversations, is what it is that we're able to share from the rich experience and expertise that you both bring, and that is within academia and RMIT, but also the questions and the engagement from the sector, and how can we learn from, Robyn, as your example, talking about what it is that you have to sit and listen and learn from practitioners who are experts in their own space with deep relationships. I think the other core thing that I would say about this conversation is the need is, and I think you said it early on, Robyn, about taking the time to build trusting relationships. You both talked about that. So thank you very much for your generosity today. It's been a really fascinating conversation. We will follow up on there. I think we pretty much covered the questions, but we'll follow up on some of that in the newsletter. And we'll be gathering ideas from each of you. If you've got any other questions that you'd like us to cover off on the newsletter, please feel free to drop it into the chat, which you can do afterwards, or send us an email, and we'll not only put out a newsletter, but Robyn, we'll have a chat about how we could have a co-design session with people with a lived experience.
Yeah, wonderful.
Of those processes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a good afternoon.